In January 1956, a train crossed the border from the Soviet Union into West Germany. On that train were 2,000 German men. They were wearing tattered Soviet prison uniforms. Most were in their 30s and 40s. They'd been teenagers when they were captured. The war had ended 11 years earlier, in May 1945. These men had been prisoners for over a decade after peace was declared. Some had spent more time as POWs after the war than they'd spent fighting in it, and they were the lucky ones. They came home. Over 1 million German prisoners never left the Soviet Union. This is the story of the last prisoners of World War II, the men the world forgot, and the 11 years that vanished from their lives. When World War II ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, everyone assumed the prisoners would go home. That's how wars work, right? You fight, someone wins, someone loses, prisoners get exchanged, everyone goes home. That's what happened after World War I. That's what the Geneva Convention said should happen. But the Soviet Union had different plans, and those plans would condemn over 3 million German prisoners to years of forced labor, starvation, and death long after the shooting stopped. To understand why the Soviets kept German POWs for 11 years, we need to understand what Germany did to the Soviet Union. Because this story doesn't start in 1945. It starts in June 1941, when Germany invaded. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. Hitler's plan was simple: destroy the Red Army, conquer Soviet territory, enslave the population, and extract resources to fuel Germany's war machine. The invasion was supposed to take 3 months. It took 4 years and destroyed both nations in the process. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was beyond brutal. It was genocidal. Between 1941 and 1945, Germany captured approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. Of those 5.7 million, nearly 3.3 million died in German captivity. 3.3 million. That's a death rate of nearly 60%. They died from starvation, exposure, disease, execution, and systematic neglect. Germany didn't consider Soviet POWs to be protected by the Geneva Conventions because the Soviet Union hadn't signed them. So German commanders treated Soviet prisoners as subhuman, disposable labor. Soviet soldiers captured in 1941 were marched hundreds of miles without food or water. They were packed into open-air camps with no shelter. They died by the thousands every day. German records from POW camps on the Eastern Front showed death rates of 1% per day in some camps during winter, 1941 to 42. 1% per day. That means in a camp of 10,000 prisoners, 100 died every single day. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Hitler and his generals deliberately planned to starve Soviet POWs. They called it the Hunger Plan. The idea was to divert food from prisoners and Soviet civilians to feed German troops and the German home front. The result was mass death on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Now here's why this matters for our story. When Soviet forces began capturing large numbers of German prisoners in 1943 and 1944, as the tide of war turned, Soviet commanders and soldiers knew exactly what Germany had done to their comrades. They knew about the death camps. They knew about the starvation. They knew that 3.3 million Soviet soldiers had died in German captivity. And they wanted revenge. The first massive surrender of German troops to Soviet forces happened at Stalingrad in February 1943. 91,000 German soldiers surrendered when the Sixth Army collapsed. Of those 91,000, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. 85,000 died in Soviet captivity. Most died in the first few months from typhus, starvation, and the forced marches to prison camps in the Soviet interior. But Stalingrad was just the beginning. As Soviet forces pushed west through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, they captured millions of German prisoners. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union held over 3 million German POWs. 3 million, the largest concentration of prisoners in history. Here's where it gets complicated. The Geneva Convention said that prisoners of war should be repatriated, sent home, as soon as possible after hostilities end. The Western Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, released most of their German prisoners by 1948, 3 years after the war ended. Not fast, but at least it happened. The Soviet Union didn't even start major releases until 1949, and they didn't release the last prisoners until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Why? The official Soviet reason was that German prisoners were war criminals who needed to be punished. The real reason was that the Soviet Union wanted slave labor to rebuild the country Germany had destroyed. Let me tell you about one of those prisoners, Helmut Schmidt. Not the famous politician, a different Helmut Schmidt, 20 years old in 1945, from a small town near Dresden. He was drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1943, sent to the Eastern Front, and captured by Soviet forces in January 1945, 4 months before the war ended. Helmut wrote about his experience decades later. The memoirs are in German military archives. He described the moment of capture. We were surrounded near the Vistula River in Poland. No ammunition, no food. We'd been cut off for 3 days. When the Soviet tanks appeared, we surrendered. There were maybe 300 of us. They marched us east. We walked for 2 weeks. No food except what we could scavenge. Men died every day. We left them by the roadside. By the time we reached the first camp, half of us were gone. Helmut Schmidt spent 11 years in Soviet labor camps. 11 years. He was 20 when captured, 31 when he finally came home in 1956. He'd lost his entire 20s, the best years of his life, gone, digging coal in Siberia. His story was common, typical, the experience of millions. Now let's talk about what life was actually like in Soviet POW camps. The conditions varied wildly depending on location and time period. The camps in European Russia were bad. The camps in Siberia and Central Asia were death traps, especially in the first few years. The Soviet Union established hundreds of POW camps across its territory. Some were near factories or mines, where prisoners provided forced labor. Others were isolated in the wilderness, where prisoners worked on construction projects, logging, or agriculture. The work was brutal. The food was inadequate. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. And this went on for years after the war ended while the world moved on. A typical day in a Soviet POW camp went like this. Wake up at 5 a.m. Breakfast was thin soup, maybe with a few grains of barley or oats, and a piece of black bread. The bread ration was usually around 400 grams, less than a pound per day. That was your primary food source. Then you marched to the work site, coal mines, timber cutting, railroad construction, factory work. The work quotas were set impossibly high. If you didn't meet your quota, your already inadequate food ration got cut further. You worked until dark, sometimes 10 or 12 hours. Then you marched back to camp. Dinner was more thin soup. Then you slept in unheated barracks on wooden bunks with minimal blankets. The temperature in Siberian winters reached minus 40 degrees. Men froze to death in their sleep. In summer, disease spread through the camps. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. There was no escape. Guards shot anyone who tried. And remember, this was happening after the war ended. While Americans were enjoying peacetime prosperity, while Germany was being rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid, these men were dying in Soviet camps. The death rate in Soviet POW camps was highest in the first 2 years after the war. Between May 1945 and December 1947, approximately 450,000 German POWs died in Soviet custody after the war ended. 450,000. They survived the war only to die in the peace that followed. Let me give you another personal story. Günter Bergmann, 22 years old, from Hamburg, captured in April 1945 during the Battle of Berlin. The war ended 3 weeks later. Günter spent the next 9 years in a coal mine in the Donbass region of Ukraine. He kept a secret diary written on scraps of paper he hid in his boots. That diary survived. It's now in the Hamburg State Archives. One entry from August 1946 reads, "Today marks 1 year since the war ended. We heard rumors that prisoners in the West are being released. Why not us? We did nothing worse than soldiers who fought in France, but we are here, forgotten. My mother thinks I'm dead. My girlfriend has probably moved on. I am 23 years old, and I feel like an old man. How many more years?" Günter Bergmann came home in 1954. His mother had died thinking he was dead. His girlfriend had married someone else. He'd lost 9 years. He developed severe lung disease from the coal dust and died in 1962, age 39. The war took his life, just slowly. Now, here's something that makes this story even more tragic. Many German POWs in Soviet camps didn't know the war had ended. The Soviets didn't tell them. For months after May 8, 1945, prisoners were still being told they were fighting enemies of the Soviet state. Some prisoners didn't learn the war was over until 1946. Imagine that. You're in a labor camp in Siberia, working 12 hours a day in a coal mine, barely surviving, and you don't even know that the war you were fighting ended a year ago. The Soviet Union had several reasons for this secrecy. First, they wanted to prevent uprisings. If prisoners knew the war was over and they weren't being released, they might rebel. Second, they wanted to maintain the fiction that the prisoners were war criminals being justly punished, not slave laborers. Third, and most cynically, they simply didn't care. These were Germans. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people in the war. Soviet leaders felt zero sympathy for German suffering. But eventually, news did spread. Prisoners who worked in cities sometimes heard from Soviet civilians. New prisoners, captured in the final days of the war, brought news that fighting had stopped. By late 1945, most prisoners knew the war was over, and that knowledge made everything worse. Because now they knew they weren't prisoners of war anymore. They were just prisoners. The psychological toll of this realization was devastating. After the war ended, many prisoners of war faced a deep emotional void. During the conflict, they could tell themselves, "I just need to hold on until my side wins," or until it's over. But after May 1945, that hope disappeared. The fighting had stopped, yet they were still in captivity, uncertain if they would ever return home. Archival records from Soviet camps show that despair reached alarming levels in late 1945 and 1946. Thousands of men who had endured years of combat and months of imprisonment began to lose their will to continue. Soviet documents, released decades later, reveal that self-inflicted deaths accounted for a notable share of post-war losses among prisoners. These were soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, survived capture, and endured the harsh early months in the camps, only to collapse emotionally when all sense of purpose vanished. Let me tell you about Kurt Schaefer, 31 years old, from Munich, captured in 1944. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, had fought for 3 years, seen horrors most people can't imagine. He survived everything the war threw at him. In November 1945, 6 months after the war ended, he hanged himself in a camp in Kazakhstan. He left a note that his fellow prisoners smuggled out years later. "The war is over, and I am still here. I cannot do this anymore. Tell my family I tried. Tell them I'm sorry." Kurt Schaefer's body was buried in an unmarked mass grave with hundreds of other prisoners. His family didn't learn he was dead until 1952, 7 years later, when the Red Cross finally gained limited access to Soviet records. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the West do more to get these prisoners released? Why didn't the United States, Britain, and France demand their return? Here's the uncomfortable truth. They did demand it. The Soviets ignored them. And the Western Allies didn't push hard enough because they didn't want to damage the fragile post-war relationship with the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning. The Berlin blockade happened in 1948 and 49. The Korean War started in 1950. NATO was formed in 1949. The West needed Soviet cooperation on various issues and didn't want to jeopardize that relationship over German POWs, who, let's be honest, were not high on anyone's priority list. Germany was divided. West Germany didn't even exist as a sovereign nation until 1949, and when it did exist, it had no diplomatic leverage with the Soviet Union. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, was a Soviet puppet state. It couldn't push Moscow on anything. So the prisoners were stuck, forgotten, bargaining chips that nobody wanted to cash in. The first major releases of German POWs from Soviet camps began in 1949. About 150,000 prisoners were released between 1949 and 1950. But that still left over 1 million in captivity. The releases were slow, strategic. The Soviet Union used POW releases as political tools. They'd release a few thousand when they wanted to signal goodwill to West Germany. They'd stop releases when they were angry about something. In 1953, something significant happened. Stalin died. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who had overseen the detention of millions of German POWs, died on March 5, 1953. His death changed Soviet policy. Not immediately, but gradually. The new Soviet leadership, initially Georgy Malenkov and then Nikita Khrushchev, wanted to improve relations with the West. One way to do that was to finally resolve the POW issue. In 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow. It was a historic trip, the first visit by a West German leader to the Soviet Union. Adenauer had one main goal: get the prisoners home. He negotiated with Soviet leaders for weeks. The Soviets wanted something in return. They wanted West Germany to establish diplomatic relations. They wanted recognition. They wanted legitimacy. Adenauer agreed. In September 1955, West Germany and the Soviet Union established diplomatic relations, and in exchange, the Soviet Union agreed to release all remaining German POWs, all of them, the last ones, the forgotten men who'd been in camps for over a decade. The final releases happened in 1955 and early 1956. Approximately 15,000 prisoners came home. 15,000 men who had been in Soviet captivity for 10, 11, some even 12 years. Men who'd been teenagers when captured and were now in their 30s. Men who'd missed everything, their 20s, marriages, careers, children, life. The trains that brought them home crossed the Soviet-German border to massive crowds. Families who'd given up hope, wives who'd remarried, thinking their husbands were dead, children who'd never met their fathers. It was joyous and tragic at the same time. Let me tell you what homecoming was like for one of these men. Friedrich Weber, from Stuttgart, captured in April 1945 at age 19, released in January 1956 at age 30. He'd spent 11 years in camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. 11 years, more than a third of his life up to that point. Friedrich's train arrived in Frankfurt in January 1956. His parents were there. His mother didn't recognize him at first. He'd left as a skinny teenager. He came back as a hollow-eyed man who looked 50. She collapsed when she realized it was him. Friedrich wrote about the reunion decades later. My mother kept touching my face. like she couldn't believe I was real. She said, "We thought you were dead. We had a funeral. We mourned you. And now you're here." I didn't know what to say. Part of me had died in Siberia. I wasn't the son she remembered. Friedrich Weber struggled to adjust to civilian life. He'd spent his entire adult life in captivity. He'd never held a regular job, never had a girlfriend, never lived independently. He was 30 years old with no education beyond basic schooling and 11 years of forced labor in coal mines. Germany had moved on. The economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, was beginning. Germany was rebuilding, modernizing, and here was Friedrich, a ghost from a war that ended 11 years ago. He wasn't alone. Thousands of returned POWs faced the same challenges. They had severe PTSD, though it wasn't called that then. They had physical health problems from years of malnutrition and hard labor. They had no job skills. Many had lost touch with family members. Some came home to find their wives had remarried, legally, after they'd been declared dead. West Germany established programs to help returned POWs, but they were inadequate. The men were given some money, some vocational training, and then expected to integrate into society. Many couldn't. Alcoholism rates among returned POWs were significantly higher than the general population. Suicide rates were higher. Divorce rates were higher. These men had survived the war and 11 years of captivity, but many couldn't survive the peace. Now, let's talk numbers, total numbers. Because the scale of this tragedy is important to understand. Germany lost approximately 5.3 million soldiers during World War II, killed in action, died of wounds, died as POWs. Of the 3.2 million German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union, approximately 1.1 million died in captivity. 1.1 million. That's a 35% death rate. Compare that to German POWs held by the Western Allies. Of the over 3 million German prisoners held by the United States, Britain, and France, the death rate was less than 1%. Less than 1% versus 35%. The difference is staggering. And of that 1.1 million who died in Soviet captivity, approximately 450,000 died after the war ended. Nearly half. Think about that. Half of the German POW deaths in Soviet camps happened during peacetime, after victory had been declared, after surrender had been accepted. They died building railroads, digging coal, cutting timber, for a country that wasn't at war with them anymore. The Soviet Union's treatment of German POWs violated the Geneva Conventions, which the Soviets had signed in 1929. The conventions clearly stated that POWs should be released as soon as possible after the end of hostilities. Keeping them for 11 years was a violation. Using them for forced labor was a violation. The death rates from neglect and starvation were violations. But the Soviets didn't care, and the international community didn't push back hard enough. Here's the thing. I want to be clear about something. What the Soviet Union did to German POWs was wrong. It was a crime. But we also need to acknowledge the context. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Germany killed 27 million Soviet citizens. Germany deliberately starved 3.3 million Soviet POWs to death. The Soviet treatment of German prisoners, while unjustifiable, was a response to what Germany had done to them. This doesn't make it right. Two wrongs don't make a right. But it explains why the Soviet Union felt justified and why the world didn't intervene more forcefully. There was a sense, particularly in the immediate post-war years, that Germany deserved whatever happened to them. The Holocaust was being revealed. The full scale of Nazi atrocities was becoming known. Sympathy for German suffering was in short supply. But here's what I think we should remember. Most of these POWs were not war criminals. They were not Nazis. Many were conscripts, ordinary men drafted into a war they didn't start. They fought because they were forced to fight, and they spent 11 years paying for crimes they didn't commit. Let me tell you about one more prisoner. Hans Becker, 24 years old, from Berlin. Captured in May 1945, literally days before the war ended, he spent 10 years in a timber camp in Siberia. He came home in 1955. He wrote a memoir in the 1970s, published in Germany. In it, he described what it felt like to be a forgotten prisoner. He wrote, "The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or the work. The worst part was knowing that the world had forgotten us. We'd hear rumors of life in Germany. The economy was growing. People were rebuilding. And we were still in Siberia, cutting trees, counting the days. Nobody cared. We'd fought a war. We'd lost. And now we were paying forever. There was no forgiveness, no mercy, just endless punishment." Hans Becker lived until 1998. He said in interviews near the end of his life that he never fully recovered from his time in the camps. He had nightmares his entire life. He couldn't stand the cold weather. The sound of a train whistle made him panic. The camps shaped the rest of his life, even 50 years later. Now we need to talk about the other side, Soviet perspective. Because this story isn't complete without understanding why the Soviets did this. From the Soviet point of view, German prisoners were enemies who had invaded their country, destroyed their cities, and killed millions of their people. The Soviet Union lost more people in World War II than any other nation. 27 million dead. That's 1 in 7 Soviet citizens. The war devastated the country. Cities were in ruins. Industry was destroyed. The population was traumatized. Soviet leaders looked at German prisoners and saw a resource, free labor to rebuild what Germany had destroyed. Why should the Soviet Union spend its own limited resources rebuilding when they had millions of German prisoners who could do the work? From a cold, pragmatic perspective, it made sense to them. From a humanitarian perspective, it was a crime. Soviet guards in POW camps varied widely. Some were brutal, some were relatively decent. Many were war veterans themselves, men who'd fought against Germany and who hated their prisoners. Others were just doing a job. Soviet camp commanders faced their own pressures. They had quotas to meet. Work had to be done. If prisoners died, there were always more prisoners. The system was designed to be harsh. One Soviet guard, whose testimony was recorded decades later, described his experience. "I was a guard at a POW camp in Ukraine from 1946 to 1949. I was 20 years old when I started. The prisoners were Germans. My older brother had died fighting Germans. My father died in a German POW camp. Was I supposed to feel sorry for them? I did my job. I made sure they worked. If they died, they died. That's war. That guard represents a common Soviet attitude. These were the enemy. They deserved what they got." But even he admitted, years later, that keeping prisoners for 11 years after the war was excessive. He said, "By 1950, I started to feel differently. The war was over. These men were just workers at that point. Many of them were decent people who'd been drafted. I began to see them as human beings, not just Germans. But I couldn't say that out loud. That would have been political suicide." The Soviet system didn't allow for compassion. It didn't allow for flexibility. The policy was set at the top, and everyone below simply followed orders. Sound familiar? That's what many German soldiers had said too. Just following orders. As releases finally began in earnest in 1955 and 56, Soviet civilians had mixed reactions. Some were glad to see the prisoners finally go home. Others resented it. Why should these Germans go home when so many Soviet families had lost loved ones forever? The Soviet government had to carefully manage the narrative. They portrayed the releases as a magnanimous gesture, a sign of Soviet strength and mercy. The reality was more complicated. The Cold War was shifting. The Soviet Union wanted better relations with West Germany, and holding prisoners for 11 years was becoming increasingly untenable internationally. When the last prisoners crossed the border in January 1956, It marked the official end of World War II prisoner issues, 11 years after the war ended. 11 years. Let that sink in. Veterans of D-Day had been home for over a decade, had gotten married, had kids in school, and these German prisoners were just now seeing home for the first time since the war. The final statistics are grim. Of the approximately 3.2 million German soldiers captured by the Soviet Union, roughly 2 million returned home eventually. 1.1 million died in captivity. About 100,000 remained unaccounted for, likely dead in unmarked graves across the Soviet Union. The peak number of prisoners in Soviet camps was reached in summer 1945, with over 3 million men in captivity. By 1950, that number had dropped to about 150,000 through deaths and limited releases. The final 15,000 were released in 1955 and 56. Those numbers represent individuals, millions of individual stories, men who were sons, brothers, fathers, husbands, men who had dreams, who wanted to live, who wanted to go home. Instead, they dug coal in Siberia. They cut timber in Kazakhstan. They built railroads in the Urals. They died of cold, hunger, disease, despair, and they did it all after the war was over, after peace had supposedly come. The irony is overwhelming. Germany started the war. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Germany committed terrible atrocities. And in the end, millions of ordinary German men paid the price for crimes committed by their leaders. The Soviet Union, devastated by Germany's invasion, responded with its own cruelty, keeping prisoners for 11 years after victory, using them as slave labor, letting them die in camps. Neither side covered itself in glory in this part of history. Let me bring this back to where we started. That train in January 1956. 2,000 men crossing the border, coming home 11 years too late. Imagine being on that train. You're 30 years old, but you look 50. You left Germany as a teenager. You're coming back as a broken man. You don't know if your family's still alive. You don't know if your hometown still exists. You don't know what Germany looks like now. All you know is that you survived. Barely. And now you get to try to figure out how to live in a world that moved on without you. Many of those men struggled for the rest of their lives. Some succeeded. They found jobs, started families, built lives. Others never adjusted. They lived as ghosts, physically present but mentally still in the camps. The psychological trauma of spending your entire 20s in captivity, watching friends die, wondering if you'd ever be free, doesn't just go away when you cross a border. West Germany tried to help. There were support programs, counseling services, financial assistance. But how do you compensate someone for 11 years of their life? How do you give back their 20s? How do you erase the memories of watching men freeze to death, starve to death, work themselves to death? You can't. You can only acknowledge it happened and try to help them move forward. The story of German POWs in Soviet camps remained relatively unknown in the West for decades. The Cold War meant that Soviet archives were closed. Former prisoners who returned often didn't talk about their experiences. It was too painful, too traumatic. And German society in the 1950s and 60s was focused on moving forward, not looking back. These men were reminders of a shameful past that many Germans wanted to forget. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that researchers gained full access to Soviet archives, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The scale of death, the conditions in the camps, the deliberate neglect, the use of prisoners as slave labor for over a decade after the war ended, all of it documented in Soviet records that had been classified for 50 years. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, memorials have been built, but for the men who lived through it, no amount of historical recognition can give them back what they lost. Friedrich Weber, who we talked about earlier, lived until 2003. He gave interviews in his later years. He said, I don't hate the Russians. I understand why they did what they did, but I also don't forgive. 11 years. They took 11 years from me. I was 19 when I was captured. I was 30 when I came home. Those should have been the best years of my life. Instead, I spent them in hell. Nothing can change that. Friedrich Weber's words represent the feelings of thousands of returned POWs. Understanding without forgiveness. Acknowledgement of context without acceptance of cruelty. They knew why the Soviets kept them. They knew what Germany had done to provoke it. But they also knew that they personally had lost their youth, their health, their futures, for a war they didn't start. The last known German POW to return from the Soviet Union was released in 1956, but the story didn't really end there. Some prisoners were never accounted for, men who died in camps and were buried in unmarked graves, men whose families never learned their fate. Even today, there are German families searching for information about relatives who disappeared into Soviet camps and never came home. The German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund, has been working since the 1990s to locate and identify German soldiers buried in former Soviet territory. They've found hundreds of thousands of graves. They've identified tens of thousands of remains, but many will never be found. Men who died building a railroad in Kazakhstan, who collapsed in a coal mine in Siberia, who froze to death in a forest in the Urals. Their graves, if they even have graves, will remain unknown forever. This is the cost of war that doesn't get talked about enough. The aftermath, the prisoners who survive combat only to die in camps, the men who live but lose years of their lives, the families who wait, hope, and eventually learn that their sons, husbands, brothers, fathers are never coming home, the psychological scars that last decades, the lives that never fully recover. World War II ended in May 1945, but for German POWs in Soviet camps, the war didn't end until 1956. 11 years later, 11 years of waiting, suffering, dying, hoping. And for those who came home, the war never really ended at all. It followed them the rest of their lives. When that train crossed the border in January 1956, it marked the close of a dark chapter in post-war history. The last prisoners were finally home. The war, truly, was over. But the cost had been staggering. 1.1 million German POWs dead in Soviet camps. Millions more scarred for life. Families destroyed, lives wasted. All in the name of justice, revenge, or pragmatism, depending on who you ask. So remember this story. Remember the men who came home 11 years too late. Remember that wars don't end when the shooting stops. They end when the last prisoner comes home, when the last body is buried, when the last trauma heals, and sometimes they never really end at all. That train in 1956 carried the last of the forgotten men, men who paid for a war they didn't start with 11 years of their lives, men who survived hell twice, once during the war and once after it, men who deserved better from history, from their leaders, from the world. But what they got was 11 years in Soviet camps and a homecoming that came far too late.